Hey everyone, today we will be learning about a new method called completing the square. Completing the square is a method used to simplify quadratic equations and then solve for x. Other methods to do this are factoring and using the quadratic equation, which you already should have learned. And now you'll be learning the third method to accomplish the objective of simplifying quadratic equations and solving for x. In this lesson, I will walk you through two examples, and then you'll have the chance to do one problem on your own. Now, before we start the lesson, there's something I want to recall. So let's just bring up an example quadratic equation. Let's say 4x squared plus 3x plus 8. Now, you've probably seen quadratic equations like this before, but what I want to show you is this. Now, you've probably learned about this before when learning about the quadratic equation, but this is something important to know when using quadratic equations. The A, B, and C. The A represents the 4, which is the coefficient or number in front of the x squared. The B represents the 3, which is the coefficient in front of the x, and the C just represents the 8, which is the C term or the number to the right of the x. This is important to know, and you'll see why later on in the lesson. Okay, let's get started. So here's our first example problem. 4x squared minus 8x minus 32 equals 0. Now, whenever you look at a quadratic equation, the first thing you should look at is if there's a GCF, or a greatest common factor, a number you can divide out of all coefficients, a, b, and c. Well, if you look at the a, b, and c, for negative 8 and negative 32, you can see you can divide the number 4 out of all three of these numbers, and after doing that, you result with x squared minus 2x minus 8 equals 0. Now we can actually start our method. So the next step is basically just to add c on both sides. Since we have a negative 8, we would just add 8 on both sides and result in x squared minus 2x equals 8. So basically, you see how negative 8 is our c value, so we just add our c value on both sides and result with this. Now this is where it gets tricky. You see how they instate, or you add a blank box on both sides of this equation. So you get x squared minus 2x plus blank box equals 8 plus blank box. Well, there's a reason to this, because the value you will insert in the blank box will lead it to make it so you can solve for x later on. But first we have to know how to solve for the value in the blank box. Well, there's an equation to do that. And that equation is b over 2 squared. And remember, like I said, the b is the coefficient or number in front of the x. So in this, it would be negative 2. So let's substitute in negative 2 for b. So you get negative 2 over 2 squared, which equals 1 squared, or negative 1 squared, which results in 1. And as you can see, that is the value we plug into our box. So now we plug in 0 to the boxes on both sides, and we get x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 8 plus 1, which would lead to x squared minus 2x plus 1 equals 9. Now remember how I told you there's a reason to this blank box? Well, now you see in the next step. You see how we go from x squared minus 2x plus 1 to x minus 1 squared? X minus 1 squared is a perfect square, and by simplifying this equation to that, it'll make it much easier for us to solve for x. Now, how do we get from x squared minus 2x plus 1 to x minus 1 squared? Well, you just factor. As you can see, if we have x squared minus 2x plus 1, well, we can just factor that into x minus 1 times x minus 1. And after doing that, you can see that these are the two same terms. Both are parentheses x minus 1 parentheses, so you can just make that into x minus 1 squared. And that is how we get this x minus 1 squared over here. So that's how we get all the way to this step, and it results in parentheses x minus 1 squared equals 9. Now the next step, well, you have to look at this side of the equation. You notice that there's a square to this parentheses x minus 1. So what you do is just square root both sides. So if you square root this side of the equation, the square root and the square would just cancel out, resulting in x minus 1. And the square root of 9 would be positive and negative 3. Well, let's think about this in reverse. Positive 3 squared is 9, and negative 3 squared is also 9. So that's why the square root of 9 would be both positive 3 and negative 3. Well, now that we have x minus 1 equals positive and negative 3, we can just add 1 on both sides. So we'd get x equals 1 plus or minus 3. And notice how there's a plus or minus 3, a positive and a negative 3. That means we're going to have two x values, and we'd find them by 1 doing x equals 1 plus 3, which equals 4, and then also x equals 1 minus 3, which equals negative 2. So that's how we get our x solutions to this quadratic equation, which is 4 and negative 2. Now let's move on to the other example. Here we have x squared plus 12x plus 32. Since there's no coefficient in front of the x squared, we don't have to simplify and find the GCF. Well, let's move on then. We can subtract the c on both sides, so we get minus 32 and then minus 32, which would result in x squared plus 12x equals negative 32. Okay. In this example, there is no blank box, but it's good to get used to doing it in your head without the blank box. So let's just think about it. Remember the equation, b over 2 squared. Well, in this case, our b is 12. So we'd have 12 over 2 squared, which is just 6 over 6 squared, which is just 36. And that's how we get our 36 in this example. So that's why we add 36 to this x squared plus 12x, which results in x squared plus 12x plus 36. And we'd also add 36 on this side of the equation to negative 32, which results in 4. Now remember the next step. After getting this equation, we want to factor it. So if we factor x squared plus 12x plus 36, we get x plus 6 times x plus 6, which remember are the same exact term, so we can just turn that into a x plus 6 squared. This is a perfect square where both terms are the same. And that makes it much easier to do the next step, which is where we just square root both sides, where the square root and the square cancels. And then the square root of 4 would be positive negative 2 because, remember, positive 2 squared equals 4 and negative 2 squared also equals 4. So that would result us in x plus 6 equals positive negative 2. And since there's a plus or minus, okay, well, the next step would technically be to subtract 6 on both sides, where you'd get x equals negative 6 plus or minus 2. And then you can see, since there's a positive and a negative, or a plus or minus 2, you would have two x values, where one would be x equals negative 6 plus 2, which equals 4, or negative 4, and x equals negative 6 minus 2, which equals negative 8. So that's how we get our x solutions to this quadratic equation, which are negative 4 and negative 8. Now it's time for you to have the chance to do a problem on your own. Here's the equation. X squared plus 4x plus 3. Now if you want to try this problem on your own, pause the video and go at it, but I'm just going to go over it right now. So here's our quadratic equation. Let's look for if there's a GCF. Since there's no term or coefficient in front of the x squared, we move on. We'd subtract the c from both sides, which would lead us to x squared plus 4x equals negative 3. Okay. Now the next step, remember, it's best to get used to not using a blank box and just doing it in your head. Okay, what's the equation? Right, b over 2 squared. What's our b? Positive 4. So we'd have 4 over 2, which is 2, and then 2 squared equals 4. So now we'd add 4 on both sides, which would result in x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals, and since we added 4 on both sides, we'd add 4 to negative 3, which is positive 1. Okay, now the next step, remember, is to factor this. And since it would result in a perfect square, we can just factor this to x plus 2 times x plus 2, But remember, if you do it right, it will always result in a perfect square where these two terms are the same. So if you want, you can just skip this step and make it with the next step, which is x plus 2 squared equals 1. Now remember, the next step, since the left side of the equation, or x plus 2 squared, is squared, you can just square root both sides, which would cancel out the square on this side, and then you just get x plus 2 equals the square root of 1, which remember is plus or minus 1, because positive 1 squared is 1 and negative 1 squared is 1. Now since we have a positive and a negative, what we would do is find both values of x. Or actually, the first step would be to subtract 2 on both sides. So we'd get x equals negative 2 plus or minus 1. Okay, now we can solve for both values of x. So the first value of x would just be x equals negative 2 plus 1, which is just negative 1. And then the other x value would be x equals x squared minus 1, which is negative 3. So that's how we get negative 1 and negative 3 for our x solution to this quadratic equation. So if you enjoyed this lesson and learned something, please drop a like, sub, and share.